Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare and welcome back to Weaving Worlds. Today, I'm going to discuss something that could exist within any speculative fiction setting, including those that are only a little distance away from reality. I'm going to discuss monsters. In the broadest sense, a monster is any living or undead creature whose existence is in some way repulsive to ordinary humans. They look ugly, they act ugly, their thoughts are ugly, anything like that. Now, since monsters don't really exist, at least not in the strictest sense of the word, what they are instead are metaphors for real things like people, mental issues, physical dangers, and so on. So when you insert a monster or a group of monsters into your setting, you should think about how you want to use them and consider the following ways that monsters are already used in fiction and mythology. The dangers of nature. A lot of early monsters are more or less based on dangerous animals and the power of nature. A person who turns into a wolf and hunts humans is a monster. Several vampire myths are based on the danger of rabies and other bloodborne illnesses. Other monsters can cause floods, volcanoes, and similar natural disasters. You also see monsters that are exaggerations of real animals, like the Kraken in Norse myth and the Leviathan from Hebrew lore. Then there are things like dragons, whose myths appear to derive from ancient cultures that found fossilized dinosaur bones and started imagining what kind of creature could leave behind such a skeleton. As far as modern settings go, it's not as easy as it used to be to invoke the fear of nature in the form of a monster. Most people these days live in towns and cities and never have to deal with untamed nature, and those that do can use modern technology to face nature on their own terms. Still, it's not impossible to use nature as a monster metaphor. Diseases are still incredibly scary, and monsters that represent diseases, such as zombies, can still have a strong impact. You can also create a location where nature is unstoppable and untamable, and the monsters that inhabit it inflict nature's wrath on any humans who enter it, such as Area X in Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy. The darkness within. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a story about a man who takes an addictive drug that turns him into a horrible person. While at first he's able to control his transformations, the evil Hyde eventually becomes the dominant personality and performs unforgivable actions. Hyde is a monster, but he's a monster of Jekyll's own making. For a related example, consider the Persona video game series. In it, the protagonist must confront and defeat the shadows of his party members. These shadows are based on the Jungian archetypes and represent a person's suppressed thoughts and anxieties, and after defeating them, the person in question has to accept their shadow so that they can begin to better themselves. You can also take this idea of an inner monster up to a society level. Maybe there's a whole race of monsters somewhere in your setting that embody everything bad about humanity. They're crude, they're violent, they're proud of their ignorance, they enslave the other races around them, and so on. Just be careful about which aspects of humanity you're declaring monstrous, because it's very easy to slide from this section into the next one. Racial prejudice. The Ferengi in Star Trek The Next Generation are supposed to be allegories of early European colonizers and traders. They care more about money than morals, they mistreat their women to a cartoonish degree, and they betray every agreement they make the moment they can make a profit from doing so. However, they also have exaggerated noses, a short height, and a stooped posture, which are features that, along with naked greed, are often used in anti-Semitic caricatures. In other words, it is distressingly easy to see the Ferengi as anti-Semitic rather than anti-capitalist. The so-called monstrous races of classical fantasy settings also invoke the specter of racism. And it's only recently that people have really started to notice this and question why it has to exist in the first place. For example, a classic paladin dilemma in Dungeons & Dragons is whether the heroes should let an orc tribe survive, or whether they should slaughter every last non-combatant and child. After all, orcs are chaotic evil. It says so right there in the monster manual, so killing them would make the world a better place. But then killing children and babies is usually a bad thing. So what to do? Well, your best bet as a setting creator is either to stop thinking that humanoids have to be evil just because they're ugly, or else to have your orcs be so monstrous that they don't have any non-combatants or children. For instance, in Warhammer 40k there are no orc women or children. Instead, the orcs reproduce asexually through spore production. 40k orcs also don't have a real society. Instead, they just do whatever the biggest orc tells them to do and make their technology work using the power of wishful thinking. But then you also have Warcraft orcs that went the other way. Starting with Warcraft 3, the orcs are certainly less civilized and refined than the humans and elves, but they clearly have a right to life, liberty, and dignity, whereas in the first two games they were simply the demon-worshipping bad guys. Divine punishment. In ancient Crete, the great king Minos was blessed with a snow-white bull to give in sacrifice to the god Poseidon. Instead, he kept the bull, and to punish him, Poseidon made his wife fall in love with the bull, mate with him, and produce the Minotaur. In certain versions of the myth, Medusa was once a beautiful woman, but was cursed with ugliness and snakes for hair when she had sex with Poseidon in Athena's temple. In the Epic of Beowulf, the first antagonist is Grendel, a descendant of Cain whose bloodline was cursed by God to appear as monsters, never know happiness, and plague humankind with violence and destruction. In a lot of old myths, monsters are a form of divine punishment. When someone defies the gods, either the gods inflict that person with a monstrous appearance, or they set a monster loose to threaten the region. Usually, a hero will eventually come along to defeat the monster, but not until after the gods have made their point. This is another form of monster that has largely fallen away in modern stories and settings. It's not just that society has become more secular, it's that we've figured out the real causes behind natural disasters, enemy invasions, animal aggression, and other things that used to be considered divine punishment. We also figured out that randomness is just randomness, and not the hand of God interfering in mortal affairs. Still, if the gods are real and present in your setting, they can absolutely create and send monsters to punish those who don't honor them properly. A challenge to overcome. Sometimes, the only reason a monster exists is so that the hero has something to defeat. In the game series Monster Hunter, the players work together to defeat monsters and collect money, trophies, and new equipment. Then there's the legend about St. George defeating a dragon and converting the town it was menacing to Christianity. Why was it menacing the town? Because it was hungry. That's it. Sometimes, a monster only has to be a monster. An inhuman beast with no greater motivation than the destruction, and no greater meaning than that of a challenge that the protagonist must defeat. However, if that's the way you want to go, you should make sure the bulk of the story follows the protagonists and their struggles. You can occasionally cut away to see what the monster is up to, assuming it's anything new, but a simple monster will not be able to drive a story. When you boil it down to something that essential, it's really more of a goal than a character. The psychological fallacy of ugliness. The English language has a lot of sayings about this sort of thing. Never judge a book by its cover. Beauty is only skin deep, and so on. The reason we have all these sayings is because it's very easy to judge someone by how they look, and assume that any ugliness or deformities on the outside are matched by an ugly mind and ugly thoughts. It's connected to that divine punishment concept I mentioned earlier. After all, if your appearance is hideous, surely you must have done something to anger the gods. It's not like bad things happen for no reason, right? This hatred of ugliness is to some extent hardwired into our brains, and so authors have been making use of this discrepancy for ages. The ape in the original King Kong was intentionally designed to be ugly, but then over the course of the movie we learn to empathize with him so that we feel sad when he dies at the end. Roald Dahl's BFG appears to be a horrible man-eating monster, but his initials mean Big Friendly Giant. Beauty and the Beast is all about the relationship between inner and outer beauty. You can use this psychological quirk in your setting by creating friendly monsters that you introduce as intimidating, but then they turn out to be kind and sympathetic. Or you could create a pair of opposites, with a handsome but horrible person on one side and an ugly but wonderful monster on the other. Or you could scale it up and create a setting where elves or space elves are pretty but evil, while orcs or space orcs are ugly but noble. Fear of the unknown. Last, but certainly not least, a monster can represent fear. Specifically, the fear of the unknown. The boogeyman who hides in your closet and steals children out of their beds. The dragons at the edge of the map. The hideous kraken lurking in the depths. All of these monsters are collections of fears and anxieties that get personified and then shared in creepy campfire tales. Fear monsters tend to be implacable and unstoppable, and at best, you can maybe ward them off by performing a specific ritual. Most of the classic slasher movie villains are fear monsters, as are the great old ones of the Cthulhu mythos. For your setting, you should be very careful about how you use fear monsters. When you learn too much about a fear monster, it stops being quite so frightening, since a big part of that fear is fear of the unknown. A fear monster should also be unstoppable, and while you can sometimes fool it or defeat it, you can never do either of those things permanently. Your fear is always there, after all, and even if you confront it, some piece of that fear will always remain. Thanks for joining me again for today's journey into Weaving Worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, support me on Patreon if you have some money, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.